Hey everybody, this video is called Look at These Kings Part 2, and tonight we're continuing our pass-through study here in the book of 1 Kings, where we're going to be looking further at more of the kings of Israel. And in 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 1 through 4, starting out, says, Then the word of the Lord came to Jehu, the son of Hanani, against Baasha, saying, Inasmuch as I lifted you out of the dust and made you ruler over my people Israel, and you have walked in the way of Jeroboam, and have made my people Israel sin, to provoke me to anger with their sins. Surely I will take away the posterity of Baasha and the posterity of his house, and I will make your house like the house of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. The dogs shall eat whoever belongs to Baasha and dies in the city, and the birds of the air shall eat whoever dies in the fields. So Jehu may have been the prophet who warned Judah's king Asa. And Jehu, like Ahijah before him, delivered the Lord's message of judgment to the king of Israel. And the pattern here, it's emerging in the book of Kings as the Lord used his prophets as a legitimate means by which to confront the sin of the kings of Israel. And Baasha had angered the Lord by following the paths of Jeroboam. And appropriately, he faced the same humiliating judgment that Jeroboam had faced. And though he waded through slaughter to his throne, he owned it to the permission of God by all whom kings reign. Because we know that God is the one who sets up kings and he removes kings. God sets up nations, he removes nations, as the prophet Daniel spoke about. And his judgment was that no long lines of heirs would succeed him. Instead, his family would be totally annihilated, and their corpse would be shamefully scavenged by hungry dogs and birds. And Baasha was the head of the conspiracy to kill Nadab. And the severance scene was like that of the house of Jeroboam back in chapter 14, verse 11. In verse 5 through 7 here it says, Now the rest of the acts of Baasha, what he did and his might, they are not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel. So Baasha rested with his fathers and was buried in Tirzah. Then Elah, his son, reigned in his place. Also, the word of the Lord came by the prophet Jehu, the son of Hanani, against Baasha and his house, because of all the evil that he did in the sight of the Lord, and provoking him to anger with the Lord, with the work of his hands, and being like the house of Jeroboam, and because he killed them. And so Jehu was a long-time prophet, as seen in 2 Chronicles chapter 19, verse 2. And 50 years later from now, he spoke to the king of Judah, Jehoshaphat. And in 2 Chronicles 20, verse 34, he wrote specific books of history regarding the kings of Israel. And God did not coerce a reluctant Baasha to conspire against and assassinate Nadab, the son of Jeroboam. But that was his wicked desire that was already in his heart. And God allows him to act out on it. And in using Baasha and bringing judgment upon the house of Jeroboam, God only needed to let Baasha do what he wanted to do. Therefore, it is proper for God to judge Baasha for something that ultimately furthered God's eternal plan. And we know that God is sovereign. In verse 8 through 14, it says, In the 26th year of Asa, king of Judah, Elah, the son of Baasha, became king over Israel and reigned 2 years in Tirzah. Now his servant Zimri, the commander of half his chariots, conspired against him as he was in Tirzah, drinking himself drunk in the house of Arza, steward of his house in Tirzah. And Zimri went in and struck him and killed him in the 27th year of Asa, king of Judah, and reigned in his place. Then it came to pass, when he began to reign, as soon as he was seated on his throne, that he killed all the household of Baasha. He did not leave him one male, neither of his relatives nor of his friends. Thus Zimri destroyed all the household of Baasha, according to the word of the Lord which he spoke against Baasha by Jehu the prophet. For all the sins of Baasha and the sins of Elah his son, by which they had sinned, and by which they had made Israel sin, and provoking the Lord God of Israel to anger with their idols. And now the rest of the acts of Elah, and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel? So, verses 8 through 14, Elah, he reigned between 886 and 885 BC. And even as Baasha inherited the throne through assassination, so was the son of Baasha was assassinated by Zimri, an officer of the army of Israel. And this massacre was an exact fulfillment of the word of the Lord through the prophet Jehu, back in verses 2 through 4 here, where it says, "Inasmuch as I lifted you out of the dust and made you ruler over my people Israel, and you have walked in the way of Jeroboam and have made my people sin to provoke me to anger and with their sins, surely I will take away the prosperity of Baasha and the prosperity of his house. And I will make your house like the house of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. The dog shall eat whoever belongs to Baasha and dies in the city, and the birds of the air shall eat whoever dies in the fields." So in less than 50 years, we see the first two dynasties of Israel's kings had come to an end, and every member of their families had been exterminated. And ungodliness is something that we should catch when we study through these passages, is that ungodliness is costly. And don't miss Zimri. Not only killed Elah's immediate family, but he also killed the extended family members and relatives of his. In verse 15 through 20, in the 27th year of Asa, the king of Judah, Zimri had reigned in Tirzah 7 days, and the people were encamped against Gibbethon, which belonged to the Philistines. Now the people who were encamped heard it said, "Zimri has conspired and also has killed the king." So all Israel made Omri, the commander of the army, king over Israel, that day in the camp. Then Omri and all of Israel with him went up from Gibbethon, and they besieged Tirzah. And it happened when Zimri saw that the city was taken, that he went into the citadel of the king's house, and burned the king's house down upon fire, himself with fire, and died, because of the sins which he had committed in doing evil in the sight of the Lord, and walking in the way of Jeroboam, and in his sin which he had committed to make Israel sin. And now the rest of the acts of Zimri and the treason he committed, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel? So we see that Zimri's reign was in 885, not 1885, but 885 BC, and was the shortest of any king of Israel. He only reigned a week. And I know some people, you're like, I wish some of these American presidents would have only had to govern for a week. But in 1830, there was another person, a king in France, had a shorter reign than Zimri, and his name was Louis Antoine the 19th, and he reigned for just 20 minutes. And I just thought that was an interesting fact, because when I read this passage, when I was studying for this, I was like, you reigned for 2 weeks as a king? Like, is there any other kings in world history that reigned shorter? And, the 19th King Louis Antoine, he reigned for only 20 minutes. Can you imagine someone being in charge for just 20 minutes? And when the soldiers of Israel in the field heard of Elah's death, they immediately acclaimed Omri, the commander of Israel's army, as their new king. And Zimri was one of the few suicides that we see in the Bible, along with Samson back in Judges 9:54 from last year, Saul last year in 1 Samuel 31 verse 4, and Ahithophel in 2 Samuel 17 verse 23, which we looked at all these just in less than a year ago, and most of them were even less than a couple months ago. But verse 21 through 28 says, Then the people of Israel were divided into two parts. Half of the people followed Timni, the son of Ginath, to make him king, and half followed Omri. But the people who followed Omri prevailed over the people who followed Timni, the son of Ginath. So Timni died, and Omri reigned. And in the 31st year of Asa, the king of Judah, Omri had become king over Israel and reigned 12 years, 6 years which he reigned in Tirzah. And he bought the hill of Samaria from Shemer for 2 talents of silver. Then he built on the hill and called the name of the city which he built Samaria, after the name of Shemer, owner of the hill. And Omri did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and did worse than all who were before him. For he walked in all of the ways of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, and in his sin by which he had made Israel sin, provoking the Lord God of Israel to anger with their idols. Now the rest of the acts of Omri which he did, and the might that he showed, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? So Omri rested with his fathers and was buried in Samaria, and then Ahab his son reigned in his place. So we see that the death of Zimri automatically placed the kingdom into Omri's hands, and half of the population, including the army, sided with Omri, while the other half backed Timni. And nothing further is known about this Timni guy, but that he was strong enough to be a rival against Omri about 4 years. And Omri, he ruled the northern kingdom from 885 to 874 BC. And from verse 23 through 2 Kings chapter 13, it contains over 1/3 of the total narrative of these books. And the coming of the dynasty of Omri to the kingship of Israel brought it with the introduction of Baal worship with official sanction in Israel. And Omri, he ruled from Asa's 27th year to his 38th year. And the notice of his beginning to reign in Asa's 31st year must be a reference to the Sol Row. And Samaria was a hill 7 miles northwest of Shechem, and it stood about 300 feet high approximately. And Samaria was reigned by other mountains, and it though stood by itself, so that attackers would have to charge uphill from every side. And this new capital amounted to the northern equivalent of Jerusalem. And its central location gave the Israelites easy access to it, and it became the capital city of the northern kingdom of Israel in the split. And in the records of secular history, Omri was one of the more successful kings, as well as a famous king of ancient Israel. And the author of Kings doesn't tell us of his fame as a monarch, but it does tell us that he was a popular king. And in 1868, the Moabite stone was discovered, and it referred to him as the conqueror of Moab. And Assyrian inscriptions make mention of him as a great warrior. And for years, the Assyrians referred to Israel as the house of Omri. And he played an impact to those even outside of Israel. And Omri means heaping, which fits, as he heaped up the wrath against the dynasty. In verse 29 through 34 says, In the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, Ahab the son of Omri became king over Israel, and Ahab the son of Omri reigned over Israel in Samaria 22 years. Now Ahab the son of Omri did evil in the sight of the Lord, more than all who were before him. And it came to pass, as though it had been a trivial thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, that he took as wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, the king of the Sidonians, and he went and served Baal and worshipped him. Then he went up and set an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal, in which he had built in Samaria. And Ahab made a wooden image, and Ahab did more to provoke the Lord God of Israel to anger than all the other kings of Israel who were before him. And in his days Hiel of Bethel built Jericho. He laid its foundation with Abram, his firstborn, and with his youngest son Segub. He set up its gates according to all the word of the Lord, which he had spoken through Joshua, the son of Nun. And so, verses 29 through 34 here, remember, in our last video, in verse 10, it stated that Asa reigned for 41 years in total. And in those 41 years, there were seven different kings of Israel. And Ahab, he reigned 22 years between 874 to 853 BC, which is also seen in the account given in 2 Chronicles chapter 18. And we'll see Ahab for the rest of the way through our study here in 1 Kings, which we're going to wrap up right after Valentine's Day. In Israel's spiritual decay, it reached its lowest point, and he was even worse than his father Omri, who was more wicked than all that were before him. And Ahab's evil consisted of perpetuating all the sins of Jeroboam and promoting this worship of Baal in Israel. And of all of Israel's kings, Ahab outraged the Lord the most that we see. And we are introduced to Jezebel here, the wretched wife of Ahab. And we are introduced to her father Ethbaal, which his name means that Baal is alive. And he was the king of Phoenicia, including Tyre and Sidon, who had murdered his predecessors. And according to historian Josephus, he was a priest of the gods Melkort and Astarte. And remember that Baal was the predominant god within the Canaanite region that meant Lord, husband, and owner. And that Baal was also known as the storm god who provided rain necessarily for the fertility of the land. And besides the widespread of Baal among the Canaanites, the Tyrians called him Baal Melkort, and the worship of Baal had infiltrated Israel long before the time of Ahab, as we saw across the book of Judges and in 1 Samuel chapter 12, verse 10. However, Ahab gave it official sanction in Samaria through building this temple for Baal. And as David captured Jerusalem and his son Solomon had built a temple for the Lord there, so Omri had established Samaria, and his son Ahab had built a temple for Baal there. And the refortification of Jericho was forbidden by God, who had supernaturally destroyed it. And Joshua did predict earlier that a man and his sons would violate God's restriction of this. And two of Hiel's sons died when they sought to assist him in fortifying the city. And Ahab's, his name meant father's brother. And so for a quick wrap up here, we look today at Baasha's rebuke in the prophecy of judgment. And we see the death of Baasha after provoking God to anger, bringing judgment upon himself. And we looked at the 2-year reign of Elah, and we looked at the 7-day reign of Zimri. And then we saw that he committed suicide in his sad state. And we must note that the Bible never approves of suicide. And, this is one of the few times that we see suicide in the Bible. And we must realize that suicide is never justifiable in God's eyes. It is self-murder. And as G.L. Morgan once stated, it is always the ultimate action of cowardice. And it is the last resort of the man who does not dare to stand up to life. And we looked at the 12-year reign of Omri. And we looked at Ahab, who began his 22-year reign. And we saw Solomon's foreign wives led to his spiritual downfall back in chapter 11. And now we see Ahab's foreign wife, Jezebel, led him and the nation into deep idolatry. And this is a very common theme, and we're even commanded in the New Testament as Christians to not be wrapped up in relationships with those who are not in Christ, those who are of the world, those who are anti-God. And do you remember in the New Testament where we see Jezebel is referenced or used in a negative thing? You have to go over to the book of Revelation chapter 2, verse 20, where it says, "Nevertheless, I have a few things against you, because you allow that woman Jezebel to call herself a prophetess, to teach and seduce my servants to commit sexual immorality and to eat things sacrificed to idols." And so, in the book of Revelations, Jesus' letter to the church of Thyatira, Jezebel is used as a symbolic symbol for the false world religion. And that's going to wrap up this video for today. We'll see you next as we'll look at the early ministry and the introduction of Eliza. And I have to be careful to say Eliza because we have our daughter Elizabeth, which we call Eliza. So if I do get it mixed up coming up, have grace with me. But I hope you have a great rest of your evening, and we'll see you next for chapter 17. God bless.